Hello and welcome to another episode of Rational Actors on Blogging Heads. I'm Kevin Glass, Director of Policy and Outreach at the Franklin Center, and today I'm joined by
Vikrant Reddy. I am Senior Research Fellow at the Charles Koch Institute.
Yeah, thanks for being on with me, Vikrant, sorry. Um, we are talking about criminal justice reform, which is a project that on the right has been kind of taken up in earnest in the last couple of months by a variety of conservative legislators. It's been pushed by the Right on Crime Project, which you used to work for, and now you've moved on to the Koch Institute. And various kind of movement conservatives all over the place. But while this has been kind of pushed into the mainstream, I would say, in the last couple of months, it's not exactly new on the right. And something that I noticed, I went to what was called the Bipartisan Summit on Criminal Justice Reform this month, or was it last month? With a variety of groups across kind of the ideological spectrum, led by Van Jones's new organization, Cut 50. The ACLU was there, but Newt Gingrich's organization was there. Right on Crime was there, obviously. There's a whole lot of groups kind of on the left and on the right now. But what struck me at that summit was the praise that a lot of people on the left had for conservatives at the state level. And this is something that I don't think a whole lot of people know about or talk about. But Van Jones, for example, and I wrote a piece for Watchdog Arena on this. Van Jones talked about how it's really conservative governors leading the way on a lot of these projects. And Right on Crime, where you used to be, is a project of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And Rick Perry actually is kind of one of the leading lights on this issue. So I wanted to get your perspective on where this movement has come from on the conservative side and where it might be going in the future.
Sure, yeah, I think we're going to have a great discussion about that today.
Yeah, so your work, I guess, at Right on Crime, obviously, would you kind of tell me how that project started, how you guys used to work with Governor Perry on some of these issues, and how the criminal justice reform issue has spread out throughout the conservative movement?
Yeah, it's a great story, and it starts more or less in 2007. This was a year when the agency within Texas that does all the number crunching came to state legislators and told them that Texas, because it was growing so rapidly, everybody's moving to Texas, was simply going to have to build more prison beds. They gave them an exact estimate, or approximation. They said 17,000 new prison beds by the year 2012 at a cost of $2 billion. Now, at the time, the chairman of the House Corrections Committee in the state of Texas was a guy named Jerry Madden, and he was an engineer from West Point, actually. And he said, I'm just concerned that if you build all of these new prison beds, you're going to find a way to fill them. And there's got to be some way that you could actually spend less money instead of $2 billion, because I'm not interested in going back to my constituents and asking for that kind of cash, and find ways to nevertheless get good public safety results. So Jerry Madden will tell you that he walked over to the Senate side and he talked to a Democratic senator, actually, a man named John Whitmire. Jerry and John are as different as it gets. One guy is from Dallas, one guy is from Houston, one guy is an attorney, one guy is a businessman, one guy is, they're just completely different personalities. One's a senator, one's a representative. And yet they found that they met a lot of, they had a lot of common ground when it came to criminal justice. And they started talking with outside advocates. They started looking for ways that they could not spend the $2 billion, because in Texas, it's very difficult to justify spending enormous sums of money. So what they hit upon was that if they spent far less, around $300 million, and they put that money into improving community supervision in Texas, making probation better, making parole better, making the drug courts a lot stronger in Texas, they would not have to spend $2 billion on prisons. And so they implemented this into the budget in 2007. Rick Perry was the governor at the time. He signed that budget. And by the time the year 2011 rolled around, Texas not only did not have to open up new prison beds, they shut down a prison, actually one in the city of Sugar Land right outside of Houston. And then in the year 2013, Texas shut down 2 more prisons. And so instead of opening up 17,000 new prison beds, you had a state where they shut down 3 prisons altogether. And I think Senator Whitmire and Representative Madden and, of course, Governor Perry get a lot of credit for this. And what was so extraordinary about it is that it happened in Texas. And Texas has this reputation, you and I are both Texans, as the ultimate tough on crime state, it's the ultimate hang 'em high state. And so Texans then were in a position to go to other states and say, here's what we did, and here's why you could do the same thing. And people would listen to them. So you can walk into a hearing room full of legislators in Mississippi or Alabama and tell them you're from Texas and they're interested. It's harder if you come from Vermont or California, something like that. So because of Texas's success, the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which had advocated for those policies in 2007, was in a position to launch a national campaign. And that sparked Right on Crime, the Right on Crime Initiative, which has been around since late 2010. And the folks of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which, as you mentioned, I used to work, will go all over the country and talk to conservative legislators, conservative governors, conservative policymakers, and advocates, and sort of tell the Texas story and talk about how successful it's been.
Yeah, the narrative of Texas as kind of tough on crime state, it's really, really powerful, I think, in the American mind. And you're right that when you say, I'm from Texas and here's what we did on crime, you know, they don't take it, like you said, like someone from Vermont saying, oh, we let all the criminals go free, or whatever the liberal caricature that a Southerner might have of
Right.
what they do in Vermont. And kind of, I think in the American imagination, Texas is, you know, the state with the death penalty. They execute their prisoners, and that kind of translates into a anti-redemption narrative, you know, that conservatives are against redemption and rehabilitation and the belief that people can get better through the criminal justice system. And I'm not sure that that's entirely correct. And one of the things that was really interesting to me at the bipartisan summit that I mentioned earlier was the figure of Chuck Colson, who was a Nixon administration official who went to prison over Watergate for, I believe, obstruction of justice. And he became a born again Christian, and he actually he was someone whose name I didn't know before I came to Washington, but looms very powerfully in the minds of a lot of these conservative reformers on these issues. So he went to prison over Watergate, and he became a born-again Christian and started a lot of different rehabilitation programs based on the idea that we can rehabilitate people through the prison system. Well, not necessarily through the prison system, but through the criminal justice system. And we don't need to be throwing people away for these really, really long amounts of time. And the other thing that I think was pretty interesting was that but that we have very high recidivism rates, and that's a sign to people that you know, the prison system isn't rehabilitating people. It's actually getting people involved in cycles where they don't break out of the criminal justice system. So, and I wanted to ask you, what are some of the things that policymakers, not just conservative legislators, but policymakers in general, can do about recidivism rates? What are some things that might be proven to bring some of those down?
Sure. Well, one of the main things is, as we mentioned in Texas, you want to take a look at improving your community supervision systems. You know, so many people get shuttled into prison, and they actually come out even worse than they started, because you go into prison and you may be a nonviolent, low-level offender, but you're going to spend time with very serious violent offenders. You're going to pick up a lot of bad habits. One of the things that's commonly said is that prison is sort of like a finishing school for criminals. So whenever possible, you want to treat people in the community rather than putting them behind bars. So if you can improve your parole and probation systems, if you can put people into drug courts where, you know, they're actually going to get drug treatment rather than sitting inside a box where they're not going to get any kind of help for their chemical addiction, you'll find that you get much better results. And the parole and probation, by the way, need to continue to be tough. You know, I think that certainly Tough on crime is a label that nobody in Texas ever abandoned. And no reformer should ever abandon. It's just different. So, for example, if you say for people who are under community supervision that you are going to have very strict reporting requirements, you are going to ensure that you have a job and that you pay restitution to your victims, you're going to ensure that you take care of your kids, we're going to ensure that if you have a drug habit, you're going to get treatment for that. That is tough on crime. That is a lot tougher than just sit in this box and hang out for a little while. And you're also going to get better results. You're going to hold these folks accountable, and you're going to find that you have reduced recidivism rates. From the evidence that we have, recidivism rates are mentioned in these 3-year cycles. So some of the states where the reforms are most recent, we don't have good data on, but we do have good data in Texas. We have good data in Georgia, which passed a series of reforms, I think about 3-4 years ago. Some data from Ohio, and they're showing that recidivism rates are declining. Public safety is improving across the board. They're actually declining in these states that have passed a lot of these great new packages of legislation more than they are in many other states. Because it is worth noting that crime is declining all over the country for all kinds of sociological reasons. And one of the real, I think, the key initiatives of this project, of this reform project, is trying to establish the point that higher incarceration does not necessarily lead to lower crime rates. That crime rates drop for all kinds of reasons, and there are ways that you can cut spending and you can cut crime and you can get better results.
Yeah, I mean, one of the I think images in my mind left over from the 90s is that being tough on crime is sending people to prison. And that has obviously shifted. Like you said, legislators and policymakers don't want to give up the quote unquote tough on crime label. They just want in someone's imagination the idea that sending people to prison in massive numbers is not what's actually quote unquote tough on crime. And one of the, like I said, the leftovers from the 90s, and this is, I get mostly informed by popular media because I was young at the time. I didn't really have a political awakening until the 2000s because I'm a millennial and blah, 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 blah. But in popular media, the conservatives and Republicans were always kind of portrayed as people who want to lock criminals away, and Democrats and liberals were portrayed as people who want to open the doors to prisons and let all the criminals out on the streets. And one of the most interesting figures I think that I've seen in the movement is Bernard Kerik, who worked as Rudy Giuliani's police chief and was one of those people who was quote unquote tough on crime. And he's a very controversial figure on the left because a lot of the policies that he instituted in New York City, they said were kind of just, they were signaling, right? They weren't actually addressing the root causes of crime. All it was just locking people away and sending them to prison. But his involvement in the criminal justice reform movement now kind of surprised me, and I think would surprise a lot of people.
Yeah, he's really eloquent on a lot of these issues. He had quite an awakening when he was behind bars, and the anecdotes that he tells are fascinating. There's one that really stands out to me. He talks about a guy he knew behind bars who was in prison because he had sold a whale's tooth illegally on eBay. And there are all sorts of people in prison who are kind of victims of overcriminalization, all of these bizarre little crimes, quote unquote, that traditionally would have been considered the kinds of things that you handle with civil fines or administrative fines, something like that, which for whatever reason we've criminalized. But there are all kinds of people like Bernie that make these observations. In fact, you mentioned Chuck Colson. Chuck Colson, when he was alive, was a signatory to Right on Crime's Statement of Principles, and many of the people who have signed on to Right on Crime's Statement of Principles will tell you that they learned a lot from Chuck Colson, that he kind of helped bring them along. Grover Norquist at the very top of the list. I think Norquist actually grew up in Massachusetts, not too far from Colson, and knew him as a child. And there are all of these really interesting figures who I'm not sure that I would say they changed their perspective, but maybe a better way of saying it is that they're getting back in touch with first principles from a limited government kind of standpoint. You know, it doesn't make any sense to say, "Well, I'm a limited government guy. I think the government should stay out of healthcare and energy and education and all of these areas to whatever extent it can. But when it comes to prisons, I'm willing to cut a blank check, lock them up, and throw away the key. I don't care about the results. I just want them locked up." That really is inconsistent. And so I think Kerik and Colson and a lot of these people are realizing that. And perhaps it took some time behind bars to recognize it. But whatever the case may be, I think they're certainly welcome reformers. And in Colson's case in particular, he was a true leader in this area.
You mentioned the idea of, being able to cut budgets through criminal justice reform. And that's something that gets a lot of traction on the right. And when you say, hey, we can, cut spending because that's one of the most popular things that the people on the right can do, you say we want to cut spending and, we want to apply our very strict budgeting ideas to not just, welfare and other stimulus or whatever types of spending that conservatives are against. You want to apply those principles to, some libertarians at the national level say, national security, but obviously prisons, things that generally conservatives have been more willing to spend on. But I've seen on the left a kind of hesitancy about the message coming out this way, saying that, hey, if conservatives are only in this for the budgetary implications, they're not really into actually improving the criminal justice system, actually improving outcomes for people who commit crimes or people who are victims of overcriminalization or people who are victims of high mandatory minimums, that they're not in it for the actual people, they're just in it for the dollars behind it.
Right. I think the best way to think about the economics involved here is to maybe think of people who identify as conservatives in three different buckets. First, there's kind of the libertarians, and they've always really been strong on the prison reform issue. And it's really not a matter of dollars. It's a matter of seeing so many Americans in cages, which feels kind of Orwellian, Then I think the social conservatives, people like Chuck Colson, people like Pat Nolan, Prison Fellowship does great work. They've been really strong leaders because, as you pointed out, they have really spread the message of family breakdown and recidivism in communities when so many young people have so many fathers locked up behind bars for their entire childhood. That's just a recipe for dysfunction. Then the third bucket is these fiscal conservatives. And I would actually say that this bucket is less important than the other two. The other two are really kind of the driving force. But there's no doubt that when you are talking to actual policymakers, people who are in office, part of the job is looking for ways to save money. And after 2008, when so many state budgets were in crisis, this was an area where you could really save. In Texas, for example, where I'm from, putting somebody on probation for a day costs about $2.99. Putting them in prison for a day costs something like $50. And in California, where the prison guard unions basically run the state, it costs something like $200. And so the price differences are just staggering. And it's money you may want to pay if it is a serious, violent, hardened offender. But why in the world would a Texan pay $50 instead of $2.99 to lock up a low-level, nonviolent drug offender? Now, Texas actually is kind of a bad example there because Texas's reforms were initiated in 2007, which was before all of these state budgets went into crisis. But certainly there are many other governors and legislators for whom I guess maybe the best way to put it is that the economic arguments were the appetizer, but they weren't the entree. Right,
yeah. And I would say kind of coming off of that, you work now at the Koch Institute, and the Kochs have gotten involved in the criminal justice reform issue. How hard is it? And the Kochs kind of loom very, very large as boogeymen in the liberal imagination. How hard is it if we go to a bipartisan summit and we get progressives in the room together, how hard is it to say, no, conservatives are actually interested in the outcomes for prisoners? We might use the dollars and cents argument to sell it to some skeptical legislators, but what conservatives really do want to do is to improve outcomes here. How hard is it to kind of overcome the liberal imagination that there must be some kind of nefarious force motivating conservatives on this issue?
Well, I hope that it won't be too hard as we go and do these things, because there is a long record for years and years of the Charles Koch Institute and Mr. Koch and his brothers supporting causes that advance human dignity, try to reduce incarceration, try and help get people back on their feet and get jobs, kinds of things that we classify the Charles Koch Institute as well-being and prosperity. And it's all perfectly consistent, as we've talked about, with a limited government worldview. In fact, the lock them up and throw away the key, I don't care what it costs attitude, that is completely opposite to the limited government worldview. So if anything, I think that the Charles Koch Institute and people who are conservatives and take a limited government perspective should, be completely on the same page. And I think that liberals who notice that should say, yeah, there's nothing inconsistent here. We've seen this from them for a very long time.
I wanted to talk about the overcriminalization issue, because that's kind of what a lot of conservatives have focused on in the wake of Ferguson and New York, and a lot of racial justice issues that have come up in the last year or so, that the idea that police are far too empowered now, that they're able to use small little technical violations of the law in order to engage in larger projects of harassment of ordinary Americans, largely Black Americans. And I wanted to get your perspective on how that plays into this, because one of the things that I've seen that has been kind of a touchstone in the conservative movement that divides people is drug legalization, or decriminalization, or what have you. Because I've seen some conservatives who are in the criminal justice reform movement who say that's a line too far. We're not going to go into drug reclassification in order to combat some of these overcriminalization issues, that we still believe that marijuana needs to be illegal, and we still do need to have penalties for that. And we might need to decrease those penalties, but we're not going to legalize it in any way. So I wanted to get your perspective on how some of those issues play into the broader criminal justice reform movement.
Right. Well, I like that you introduced the questions about race by talking about overcriminalization, because I do think that they're really closely connected. The best way to think about this is with that tragic story of Eric Garner in Staten Island. Everybody knows that last year he was selling loose cigarettes at a corner in Staten Island, and this was a criminal act in New York. And so he was accosted by these police officers. He was put in a chokehold, and he died. And it was an absolutely tragic event, and a lot of the narrative around it surrounded race. But as I read about it, one of the questions that loomed very large in my mind is, why in the world is it criminal to sell individual cigarettes on a street corner in Staten Island? And then you start thinking more about that. How many trivial little crimes do we have in the books that are used as pretexts from time to time so that officers can pick on certain people, they can harass certain people, or you could even say, how many trivial little crimes are there that officers who are perfectly well-meaning and don't want to harass anybody nevertheless feel obligated to enforce, because, let's face it, that's their job. They were given these marching orders by our policymakers. I mean, there's just so much dysfunction in this area. And I think that one of the key things that policymakers can do is to be careful not to pass all of these trivial little crimes, because they are going to be abused. There's a law professor at Yale, a liberal law professor named Stephen Carter, who said something that I think is incredibly eloquent. He says that he tells all of his first-year criminal law students, don't pass criminal laws unless you think you're willing to kill to enforce them. Because that's what the police are empowered to do at the end of the day. They are empowered to kill, to enforce law on behalf of the state. And so we really want to be sure that we're serious about that law and that law is necessary. Now, that entire set of issues, I think, is distinct from the drug question. Interestingly, the drug question doesn't seem to be a big part of the overall criminal justice reform movement. I think that they can be separate conversations. Most of the people who are interested in criminal justice reform, I mean 99% of the people, left, right, what have you, generally think that the key issue here is helping people get treatment for their drug problems. And making sure that we can send them to drug courts, making sure that we can help people kick the habit, and just get them the resources that they need for treatment. That's a different question than whether or not something should be legal or illegal. That's really a whole different debate. But I think everybody within the reform movement agrees that we need to handle the drug problem in the country a little bit better. What I say is that we should continue the war on drugs, but change the battle tactics. Instead of looking at incarceration as our go-to tactic, we need to look at treatment and rehabilitation as our go-to tactic.
Yeah. One of the things, though, I've seen, and this is, more liberals being skeptical of this, is that those treatments, those cost money, and that's something that we need to, and this is just my anecdotal experience in the conservative movement, that's something that might be a hill for conservatives to climb over. And because a lot of people, they look at addicts and they say, well, that's just a problem of free will. That's just a problem of initiative. And if they can't get over it by themselves, there's no reason why we need to be spending money to help them. So that seems to be something that, and maybe that seems to be something that I might buy the liberal critique on, which is that a lot of conservatives don't seem to want to have some of these rehabilitation programs that might do a lot of good.
Yeah, I think that the money argument's a bit of a red herring because, as we talked about, the difference in cost between strong probation programs and prison is just so vast. It does cost money to do drug treatment, but really it costs nothing compared to what prison costs. And really the best model for doing these kinds of things is to take your savings from being able to shut down prisons like the 3 that we shut down in Texas, and then to reinvest those savings into better drug treatment and better rehabilitation and programs to help people get back on their feet in the reentry process. And many, many states have done that. I said Texas and Georgia and Ohio, but Kentucky and South Carolina recently, Mississippi and Alaska have all been involved in work like this. And that's the model I think that states should follow.
Yeah. I wanted to get back to the overcriminalization issue because I think it's something that a lot of conservatives can relate to and actually can make a lot of traction with. If you say, we have police departments across the country that enforce the law on a racially biased basis, that they're arresting more black men for crimes than they would white men, that if you say, well, we need to decrease the number of these kind of minor technical borderline crimes, then it's harder for a racist cop to enforce some of to harass some, minorities. There's a really good book that I recommend to everybody called 3 Felonies a Day by Harvey Silverglate. Yeah. Everyone should read it because some of the conservatives I talk to, the kind of no BS, tough on crime, blah, blah, blah conservatives, they say, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear from the police. And that's just not true. It would be like if I said, would you be okay with every car coming with a government speed monitor? And the moment that you go over the speed limit, it issues you a ticket. And of course they say no. And I say, well, that's in every person's life on a daily basis, you're breaking the law. And it just matters which laws they are. And you trust that the police aren't going to be hounding you for some of those things. And in the wake of the Ferguson DOJ report, there was one that kind of stood out to one instance that stood out to me that discussed a man who had been playing basketball, was sitting in his car in a public park, and an officer approached him, and supposedly the officer suspected him of being a pedophile because he was just sitting in his car at a public park. He eventually arrested him on multiple counts, including giving a false name, because the man identified himself as Mike when his official name is Michael. And it's those kinds of issues that I think anybody should be able to say that's ridiculous. And when you're empowering police officers and police departments to be able to arrest someone for identifying themselves as Mike rather than Michael, you have to see the injustice there. And it's something that I think conservatives who should be skeptical of government power, including your local police power, should be able to get some traction on.
Oh, I think you're exactly right. So at the federal level, we have something like 5,000 individual crimes. And by the way, my friends at the National Association for Criminal Defense Lawyers tell me that I'm undercounting, that we're probably closer to 6,000. Then on top of that, you've got all of these agency decisions that they're able to enforce using the power of the criminal law. Those numbers, something like 300,000. Now, that's just the federal crimes. At the state level, you have thousands and thousands of little crimes, too. Where you and I are from in Texas, there are 11 different felonies related to oyster harvesting in one way, shape, or form. No, it's true. And people can get picked up for anything. There's a quote from Joseph Stalin's chief of the secret police, where he said something to the effect of, "Bring me the man and I'll find you the crime." And I think it's absolutely chilling. And as Harvey Silverglate points out in that great book, 3 Felonies a Day, we really kind of have reached a point like that. Here's a small anecdote to tell you, maybe to give the audience a sense of how something that is well-meaning becomes a big part of the overcriminalization problem. So in many states right now, they are passing these laws to prohibit texting while driving. Now, let me start by saying that texting while driving is one of the most foolish things anybody could possibly do. I don't do it. I don't recommend that people do it. You could kill someone. I mean, it's really, really a bad idea. Now, having said that, I am skeptical whether the prohibitions on, the legal prohibitions on texting while driving are perhaps going to cause more trouble than they're worth. I mean, how many people are going to get pulled over and be told by a police officer, "Well, I think I saw you with a cell phone in your hand," and are going to be accosted for things like this? I mean, I'm sure that these kinds of pretextual stops happen all the time. We don't actually have on data on texting while driving. These laws are so new. But this is the kind of thing that we should be thinking about. This is the kind of thing that we should be worrying about. And law is a very blunt instrument for social control. There are other things that are far stronger. Social norms are much, much stronger. Law is such a blunt instrument that if you try to regulate society excessively using law, I think you're going to find a lot of unintended consequences and a lot of very counterproductive things happening.
Right. I'm not sure if I'm with you on the anti-texting while driving bans, but my thing that I think a liberal would say you're insane about is I'm against seatbelt laws. They say you're insane. Why would you be against a seatbelt law? But yes, to the extent that, you know, there are a lot of laws out there that people break on a daily basis. And if an officer is empowered to say, "Oh, I think I saw you with a cell phone," and pull you over and harass you, even if you're let go, that's valuable time that you're spending under the thumb of government law enforcement. And that's something that I think anyone should be concerned about.
Oh, absolutely. And another thing, by the way, because we've said a couple of times, both you and I, we've talked about police harassment, but I also want to be careful about that phrase. You know, I think that there are probably many, many cases in which the officer is just trying to do his job. And it's worth asking whether or not the job we gave him is a trivial one, is not really the best use of his time.
Sure.
And yeah, you know, I remember talking to this prosecutor in Texas who said, this is an interesting moment. I was talking about some marijuana regulation, something that I wanted to take a second look at. I can't even remember the exact law back in Texas, but I said to him, now I know as a prosecutor you're going to disagree with me. And he kind of cut me off and he said, look, don't assume that just because I'm a prosecutor, I'm going to instantly disagree. This is, these little marijuana laws are not the kinds of things that get me up in the morning. They're not the reason I went to law school. They're not the reason I wanted to go into law enforcement. I want to catch murderers, rapists, and kingpins. That's really where the glory in the job is. And I thought that was really an interesting insight. And I bet it applies to police officers too. I bet that people who are in the police academy want to catch murderers and rapists and kingpins. That's why they got involved in the work. That's what they dream about. And yet if we tell them, well, go catch the guy who's selling loose cigarettes on the corner in Staten Island, I don't think that that's really the best use of their time. And I don't think that they enjoy doing that kind of work, many of them.
Sure, yeah. I don't want to denigrate all of law enforcement because by and large, well, I would say by and large, they are good people, like you said, who get into it for good reasons. But even a couple bad apples is a really bad thing. And I think that we've seen that in a lot of different places. You can have a very statistically small percentage of the law enforcement population who go overboard, and that can still be something to be very concerned about. And the best way to fight those bad apples is to be able to take away some of the laws that they're using. And like you said, for the good apples, to make sure that they're focusing on the big issues that really are kind of menaces to public safety and public society.
Absolutely. And, there's a lot of discussion right now about cameras and about, cameras on police officers or, individuals who are filming police officers with their cell phones. And there's no question that these cameras are going to find those bad apples, more likely to find those bad apples. But the cameras are also going to help protect, I think, the good apples among police officers. There are plenty of instances where I think just because of media sensationalism, something that an officer did that was perfectly reasonable gets blown out of proportion. And the reason that I would favor and encourage a lot more of these cameras and a lot more of these recordings is, one, because I think we'll identify the bad apples, but two, because I think we're going to help protect the good apples.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's about all the time we have today for Blogging Heads. Thanks for joining me, Vikrant.
Thanks. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I guess I'll just close by saying go Mavericks tonight.
Go Rockets.